They didn't say I wasn't part of the family. They just didn't leave a single photo of me on the wall. The day I arrived at Daniel's birthday party, his 40th, I wore the green cardigan he once said made me look like spring. I baked the apple cake from my old recipe, the one he loved as a boy. I tied a ribbon around the box, wrote his name by hand like I used to on school lunches. The house was different big, modern, cold. People were everywhere laughing, drinking, lifting glasses. I didn't know most of them, but that was okay. I wasn't there for them. I scanned the room, hoping to find at least one photo, maybe the one where I taught him to ride his bike, or the blurry one from his high school graduation. But every frame held the same cast: Daniel, Eleanor, the kids, Eleanor's parents, some beach trip I'd never been invited to. When I reached the entry table, Eleanor walked up, smile tight as ribbon. "Oh, you made it," she said. Not warmly, just surprised. "We didn't think you'd remember." Before I could speak, she turned to the woman beside her and added, "This is Margaret. She helped raise Daniel when he was little. Sort of like a live-in nanny back then." I said nothing, not because I agreed, but because the words were too far behind the lump rising in my throat. Daniel glanced over briefly, then back to his guest. His drink never left his hand. He didn't correct her. He didn't even smile. I placed the cake gently on the table and stood there, suddenly unsure whether I had brought a gift or a relic. Later that week, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a clinical letter signed by a psychiatrist I'd never met, referencing a request initiated by my son. A preliminary evaluation was being scheduled to assess signs of cognitive decline. I read it twice, then a third time. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I was still. Because somewhere in that stillness I understood. They weren't saying I was insane. They were simply hoping I'd stop remembering. But I hadn't forgotten. Not the child I saved. Not the sleepless nights. Not the scraped knees or whispered lullabies. I remembered everything. And maybe that's what made me dangerous. They didn't call me insane. I just remembered too clearly the things they wanted to forget. I still remember the night I met him, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was quiet, almost invisible to the world, like most of the things that end up mattering most. It was 1983, deep winter in New Hampshire, the kind of cold that slips into your bones and rearranges the way you carry silence. I was working the late shift at St. Mary's, exhausted, surrounded by the antiseptic glow of fluorescent lights and the low hum of machines breathing for people who couldn't anymore. A nurse wheeled in a bassinet. Inside was a baby, days old, wrapped in a thin blue blanket, cheeks red from crying, eyes barely open. There was no mother, no paperwork, just a note taped to his chest with shaky handwriting. "Daniel, please take care of him. They left him in the corner room near the laundry chute. Said the authorities would handle it." But something in me cracked open. I was 24, unmarried, no family to answer to. I sat beside him for 2 hours, humming old Irish lullabies my grandmother used to sing. He stopped crying. His whole body relaxed, like he recognized something in my voice that told him he wasn't disposable. I didn't decide. I just did. That night, I walked out with him in my arms, wrapped in a heavier blanket I'd brought from the staff room. I didn't sleep. I fed him with trembling hands, counted his fingers 100 times, cried when he yawned. For 6 years, I raised him without papers, without a name anyone else recognized. I called him mine. When the legal system finally caught up, I told them he was a distant cousin's child I'd taken in. They asked too few questions. I gave too little truth. But he was safe. That was all that mattered. Our house was small, creaky, drafty in the corners, but I sealed the windows with towels in winter, baked cornbread from scratch, sewed his Halloween costumes myself. He never had store-bought toys, but he had stories. Endless stories. And a garden we built together from seed packets taped to the fridge. I never told him the truth about how we met. I wanted him to grow up feeling chosen, not abandoned. And every night, after he fell asleep, I'd open one of the cloth-bound journals I kept in the kitchen drawer and write him a letter. Not to give him one day. Not for anyone to read, just so the weight of loving him had somewhere to go. Today you smiled with both teeth missing, and I thought you were the bravest pirate I'd ever seen. You asked if dandelions had feelings, and I didn't have the heart to say no. You got sick and threw up on my sweater, and all I could think was how grateful I was that you still needed me. By the time he was 10, I had 23 journals. By 18, I had filled a whole drawer. He never saw them. He didn't need to. Love, when it's real, doesn't beg for witness. It just stays. I watched him grow tall, faster than I was ready for. When he got into a boarding school, I said yes, even though I cried into his pillow every night the first month he was gone. I didn't tell him. He needed to fly. I didn't want to clip his wings with guilt. He called, at first, then less, then not at all. When he graduated from medical school, I watched the live stream online. I clapped in an empty room. When he married Eleanor, he sent a photo of the invitation but never followed up. I assumed it was lost in the mail. I wore a dress that day anyway. Sat on the porch in case he called. He didn't. It's easy to think memory fades with age, that old women just misplace time. But I never forgot. I remembered his first steps, the way he screamed when he got his first bee sting, the time he kissed a frog because he thought it would turn into a princess, and how disappointed he was when it didn't. I remembered the long nights when he had the flu and I held a cold rag to his forehead while whispering, "I've got you, baby, I've got you." I remembered the note on his hospital onesie. I remembered the cold tile under my feet the night I walked out of that hospital with him. I remembered what it meant to love someone with your whole body, with your reputation, with your freedom. I remembered even when he tried to forget. They said I was losing my grip, that I confused facts with fantasy. But it wasn't my mind that was slipping, it was the space I held in his memory that was shrinking. I wasn't forgetting. I was remembering more than he could bear. They didn't call me insane. I just remembered too clearly the things they wanted to forget. The first time I met Eleanor, she didn't shake my hand. She looked at me like someone who had already decided I didn't belong in the story she was trying to write. Daniel brought her home one Christmas, years after he'd moved out, and she arrived with a tote bag full of artisanal gifts wrapped in burlap, and a candle that smelled like cardamom and detachment. I had made stew, the kind Daniel used to ask for on snow days, and she said she was gluten sensitive, even though I hadn't served bread. She walked through the house like she was taking inventory, pausing at photos, lifting dust from corners, glancing toward the kitchen with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Daniel followed her every movement, his laugh a little too eager, like he was trying to prove something. I sat across from them at the table, watching his hand brush her arm gently when he thought I wasn't looking. And for a moment, I was proud he had learned how to love softly. But when I asked how he'd been, he answered in clipped syllables. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about the garden, or the neighbors, or whether the leak in the roof had gotten worse. He asked if I had considered moving closer to town, somewhere more assisted. He called it. I smiled, bit my tongue, poured more tea. The second time I saw her, it was after their wedding. I hadn't been invited. They said it was small, intimate, family only. I told myself maybe the invitation got lost. I baked a cake anyway, watched the weather for their honeymoon city, waited for a phone call that never came. When I finally visited their new house, she met me at the door wearing a robe that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She hugged me like it hurt. Her arms barely grazed my shoulders. And when I stepped into the foyer, she apologized for the mess, though there was none. Their walls were covered in photos: Daniel in college, Daniel in his white coat, Daniel holding a newborn baby I hadn't yet met. Not one picture of our house. Not one photo of him younger than 20. I spotted a frame turned face down on the sideboard and wondered for a second if maybe they kept me there, at least in private. But it was just a mirror. Eleanor led me to the nursery and introduced me to Lily, my granddaughter, with the kind of rehearsed grace you use with polite strangers. She said, "This is Margaret, Daddy's old friend. She helped raise him when he was little." I stood there, blinking, my hands trembling against the baby blanket I had crocheted in the quiet of last spring. Daniel didn't correct her. He stood by the window, rocking slightly, avoiding my eyes. My voice caught in my throat, too dry to argue. Later that day, I offered to help clean the kitchen. Eleanor said, "Oh, don't worry. The cleaner comes tomorrow." I left before dessert. I walked the 5 blocks to the station instead of asking for a ride. I needed the cold air to remember how to breathe. After that, it was silence. Birthdays passed. Holidays folded into one another like empty boxes. I sent cards. They weren't returned, but they also weren't acknowledged. I began to wonder if I had imagined my place in their life. If the decades I had poured into Daniel were chapters he had long since edited out. I told myself stories to stay sane, that they were busy, that young people forget, that I was asking for too much. But the truth began to press in through small cracks: postcards never replied to, voicemails left unread, my name excluded from the emergency contact list when Daniel had a minor car accident and didn't think to call me. I heard about it through a neighbor who followed him online. Then came the dinner. One quiet evening, Daniel called, said they'd love to have me over. I dressed carefully, brought wine, even though I don't drink. When I arrived, Lily had grown. She looked like Daniel when he was 4, same curls, same serious eyes. She reached for me. Eleanor quickly redirected her. At dinner, I brought up the time Daniel had drawn a mural on his bedroom wall with crayons. Eleanor laughed uncomfortably and said, "Oh, he never mentioned that. He always says he was a neat kid." Daniel changed the subject. I sat through the meal like a guest in a play I used to star in, now reduced to a background actor who didn't know her lines anymore. As I was leaving, I reached to hug Daniel. He patted my back with one hand, the other already reaching for the doorknob. That was when I felt it, the thing you can't name but know is there. That moment when the space between people isn't just distance, it's decision. They had decided who I was allowed to be. And it wasn't mother. It wasn't even history. I was an anecdote. A chapter skipped. A cautionary tale in someone else's biography. I went home, opened the top drawer of my dresser, and reread one of the earliest entries from his childhood journal. Today, he said, "I love you," without prompting. I pretended not to cry. He looked proud of himself for making me smile. That entry was dated March 12th, 1989. I remembered the way he pronounced it, IWUVU. I remembered the peanut butter on his cheek, the mismatched socks, the sunshine pouring through the window like the world hadn't yet learned how to disappoint us. But he had forgotten, or worse, he had remembered and chosen not to care. They didn't erase my name from their lives. They just rewrote the story without me in it. It arrived folded neatly in a cream envelope with no return address, as if dignity itself had chosen not to sign the card. I remember the way the paper felt between my fingers, heavy, expensive, detached. It was a letter from a clinic I'd never heard of, informing me that a preliminary cognitive assessment had been scheduled in my name, initiated by my son, citing concerns about memory impairment and potential age-related decline. I read it once, then again, then a third time, slower. The words didn't sting at first. They sat quietly on the page, like polite guests who'd overstayed their welcome. I placed the letter on the kitchen table and stared at the chair across from me, the same chair where Daniel used to sit in his pajamas, asking for more syrup, tapping his fork against the plate like he was conducting an orchestra. That chair hadn't moved, but he had. He'd moved further than I ever imagined a child could move from the woman who once caught his vomit in her bare hands without flinching. I didn't call him. I didn't scream. I didn't even cry. I just folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where I kept his childhood drawings. The next morning, I showed up at the clinic on time. I wore my nicest coat, the navy wool one with the silver buttons, the one Daniel used to call my principal coat because it made me look like someone important. I brushed my hair, applied a little rouge, and tucked a notebook into my purse, not for show, but because I had things to remember. The waiting room was sterile, all beige and piped-in piano music, the kind that fills space without ever touching you. When they called my name, I stood tall the way I used to stand when Daniel fell and looked to me to decide whether it was worth crying over. The young psychiatrist was kind, too kind, like someone trained to handle breakables. She asked me where I lived, what day it was, who the president was. I answered without hesitation. Then came the deeper questions, the ones dressed up as concern, but meant to poke holes in your sense of self. Did I ever get confused at night? Had I misplaced important things? Did I find myself forgetting names of people close to me? I wanted to laugh. Not because the questions were funny, but because I had spent the last decade remembering names that no one else bothered to say out loud anymore. I remembered the names of Daniel's childhood friends, Alec, Jordan, Keisha. I remembered the school nurse who called me once to say he'd fallen and scraped his chin. I remembered the exact pitch of his voice when he had night terrors and called out for Mama like it was the only word that could anchor him to this world. But none of those answers fit in their forms. So I stayed quiet. Let them do their work. They gave me tests, draw a clock. Name as many animals as I could in a minute. Recall a list of 5 words. I played along. I gave them lions and giraffes and walruses. I drew a perfect clock. I recited the words backward. They scribbled notes while nodding. I nodded back, not out of agreement, but because I had learned that silence is often mistaken for submission. When it ended, they thanked me, told me someone would follow up. I smiled, said thank you, and walked home, each step slow but steady, like someone who had just come from identifying a body that looked too much like herself. That night, I opened my notebook and began writing, not for them, not for Daniel, but for myself. I wrote down everything I could remember: the date he first tied his own shoes, the song he sang off-key when we planted our first tomato seeds, the face he made when he saw snow for the first time. I wrote because I needed proof that I was still whole, that I was still here. The results came a week later. The clinic called and said there was no sign of cognitive impairment, that I was remarkably lucid for my age, as if lucidity was something I needed to perform to deserve dignity. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, not because I had passed their tests, but because I shouldn't have had to prove my mind to the child I once carried in the curve of my arm like he was made of breath. Later that evening, I received a voicemail from Daniel. He said he was glad I had gone, that Eleanor had been worried, that it was just a precaution. His voice was calm, measured, rehearsed. At the end, he added, "You know I love you, right?" I didn't call back, not because I didn't love him, but because love doesn't sound like a question. It sounds like someone showing up with soup when you're sick, or remembering your birthday without needing Facebook to remind them. Love doesn't call you insane. Love asks what you remember and listens. I sat at the kitchen table, same one I'd had for over 40 years, and placed the test results next to my notebook. 2 stacks of paper, one clinical, stamped, validated by strangers, the other, full of stories, smudged with time, validated by memory. Guess which one felt more real? They didn't say I was losing my mind. They just hoped I'd forget the parts that proved I still had one. There's a sound that old wood makes when you know where to press just the right corner of the hallway. Just the right angle of weight. It groans like it remembers something you forgot. Like it's been waiting for you to come back. That night, long after the letter and the assessment and the message Daniel left that ended with a hollow, "You know I love you." Right. I found myself standing barefoot in that hallway, the one he used to run down in footy pajamas when he was 5, shouting that the floor was lava. My knees crackled as I knelt, slower than I once would have, and I slid my fingers under the warped edge of the floorboard near the linen closet. The plank lifted with a sigh, and there it was, the tin box. It wasn't beautiful, not the kind people collect, just a rusting, dented cookie tin from the 80s with faded holly leaves on the lid. But inside was a life no one had asked to see in decades. I carried it to the kitchen table, set it down like something sacred. This house had seen so much of him: his first lost tooth, his first panic attack, his first apology scrawled in red crayon and folded into my coat pocket. I opened the lid, slowly. The smell of old paper rose like breath. On top were the journals stacked neatly, dozens of them, each wrapped in a rubber band so worn it crumbled in my fingers. I picked one, August 1987, and began to read. You fell asleep in my lap after eating too much watermelon. I didn't move for 2 hours, not because you needed the rest, but because I needed the weight of you. Another April 1992. You told me you wanted to be a doctor so you could fix broken people. I didn't tell you that sometimes love isn't enough to heal what others can't see. There were hundreds, thousands of entries, none of them meant to be seen. I had written them in silence, over cereal, over coffee, in waiting rooms, in fear, in hope. When I had no one to talk to, I spoke to the page, not to vent, to witness. Beneath the journals was a folded blanket, the tiny one he used to carry everywhere until it fell apart. I had sewn the edge back together 6 times before he finally forgot it. And then, at the bottom, beneath a bundle of yellowing drawings and the receipt for the first pair of shoes I ever bought him, was the envelope. White, brittle with time, his file, the one with his real birth date, the name of the hospital, the note pinned to his chest. I had kept it sealed all these years, not because I was ashamed, but because I believed love could rewrite beginnings. I believed that if I gave him enough of me, he'd never wonder where he came from. But standing there with that file in my hands, I realized that wasn't just naive, it was dishonest. I had erased the pain of how I found him and painted over it with devotion, thinking I was protecting him from the truth. But in doing so, I had made myself easy to erase, too. Because if you've always been there, with no origin, no ceremony, no story, then maybe people assume you'll always be there, even if they never look back. I spent the night reading. I didn't sleep. I brewed tea I didn't drink. I turned pages until my fingertips went gray. And at sunrise, when the house was still and the wind rattled the windows just enough to remind me I was alive, I gathered everything, the journals, the drawings, the file, and I packed them into a clean box. Not the tin, that could go back under the floor. This time, I needed something meant to be opened. I wrapped it all in brown paper, wrote a note, and sealed it with tape. Then I addressed it to a name I had circled in a magazine months ago. Clara Boone, editor, Silent Voices Journal, a publication I had followed quietly for years, one that published stories no one else wanted, stories that sat in the throat like unsaid prayers. I told her the truth, not just about Daniel, but about what it means to be someone who loves without being named, who stays after being uninvited, who remembers every small thing after being called forgettable. I wrote about how I carried a child into a future I wasn't allowed to be part of, how I taught him to tie his shoes and spell extraordinary, only for him to declare me confused when I remembered more of him than he was comfortable owning. I didn't ask for pity. I asked to be heard. I signed it simply Margaret Eves, former nurse, always mother. I walked to the post office just before noon, mailed the package, and came home to find the floorboard still open, like it was waiting for something else. I didn't close it. I left it ajar, because some truths don't need hiding anymore. They didn't burn the past. They just buried it, where they thought I'd never go looking again. The email arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked between spam and a reminder for a dentist appointment I had no intention of keeping. And yet the moment I saw the subject line, we read every word my breath caught like a thread snagged in a closing drawer. I clicked before I could brace myself. And there it was, a message from Clara Boone, the editor of Silent Voices, whose words I'd admired from afar for years. She didn't open with formalities, didn't soften the landing. She wrote, "Your story broke something open in me. It wasn't just honest, it was undeniable." She told me they wanted to run it exactly as I had written it, word for word, journal excerpts included. Every quiet moment I'd lived through no longer treated as background noise, but as a symphony someone had finally stopped to hear. She said the piece would anchor their next issue, one dedicated entirely to women erased in plain sight. She asked if I had a title in mind, and I didn't hesitate. I typed it slowly, deliberately, as if naming it gave it breath. The Child Who Forgot. I sat there for a long time after sending the reply, not smiling, not weeping, just still, like the air itself had been waiting for this exhale. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't call Daniel, didn't warn Eleanor, didn't post anything because I didn't have a place to post from. I let the silence stretch out around me like a cathedral, because for the first time, it didn't feel like a punishment, it felt earned. The piece went live the following Monday. I don't know how fast things move online, but by the time I checked my email that evening, there were already over 100 messages, some from strangers who called me brave, others from women who said they, too, had raised children they weren't biologically tied to and had been forgotten the moment they were no longer useful. A librarian in Ohio wrote to say she wanted to use the piece in a class about maternal narratives. A woman in Belgium offered to translate it. One note simply said, "You put into words what I've been carrying in silence for 30 years. I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't used to being seen like this, not as a warning, not as a burden, not as an old woman who maybe remembered things wrong, but as someone who had lived a life that mattered. Even if no one framed it on a wall." I made tea, sat at the table, folded and refolded the napkin in my lap. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt returned. Like something had found its way back to me. Later that night, Silent Voices posted the feature on their social media, and someone tagged Daniel in the comments. I saw it not because I was watching, but because someone forwarded it to me. His name sat there beneath a sentence I had written decades ago. He once asked if all mothers loved their children the same. I told him love isn't measured by blood, but by who stays when everyone else leaves. Underneath, someone had written, "You were lucky to be raised by her. Don't forget again." The next day, a reporter from a national newspaper called, then a radio station, then a documentary filmmaker. I said no to all of them, not because I was afraid, but because the story had already been told. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about Daniel anymore. It was about the record, the proof, the fact that I had lived this truth in a quiet house with creaking floorboards and journals in a tin box. And now the world had heard it. They didn't give me a microphone. They didn't throw me a parade. They simply stopped talking long enough for my silence to echo. And that, somehow, was louder than anything I could have screamed. They didn't raise their voices to answer me. They just finally ran out of ways to ignore what I never stopped saying. He didn't knock like someone unsure of being welcomed. He knocked like a man who thought the door still owed him something. 3 short raps. Impatient, not forceful, but just enough to say he expected to be let in. I knew it was him before I looked through the window. Daniel had that rhythm in his hands. Even as a boy, tap, tap, pause, tap, like a code only I used to understand. I opened the door without a word. He looked older than the last time I saw him. Not in the hair or the skin, but in the eyes, tired, guarded, scanning me like I might be someone else in disguise. He held his phone like a shield and a folded newspaper under his arm. And the moment our eyes met, he exhaled sharply, not relief, not regret, something closer to annoyance cloaked in civility. "Can I come in?" he asked, and I stepped aside. The silence between us not broken but simply widened by his presence. He walked into the house like it was unfamiliar, like he'd forgotten the shape of the floor, the weight of the air, the way the walls remembered every footstep. He didn't sit. He stood near the table where I had read his childhood journals out loud to no one but the shadows. And he placed the newspaper down as if it were evidence. My face was on the front page, small, quiet, but unmistakable. The mother who wasn't forgotten after all. "You couldn't have told me," he asked, jaw tight, voice low like he was trying to control the volume but not the heat. I didn't answer, not because I had nothing to say, but because he wasn't asking. He was accusing. "You made me look like a villain," he added, not looking at me. Just at the table, the paper, the space I still existed in without his permission. I walked to the counter, poured a cup of tea, offered him none. "You declared me unwell," I said finally, each word measured like medicine, "and you did it quietly, with signatures and referrals and polite concern. I told my truth without naming you once." He turned sharply. "People know. People are messaging me. My colleagues are learning you had a mother," I interrupted, setting my cup down without noise. "That's not a scandal. That's a correction." He ran his hands through his hair like a man trying to find his place in a story he thought he'd written. "Why now?" he asked. "After everything." After so long, I walked to the drawer, the one he used to sneak candy from when he thought I wasn't looking, and I pulled out the first journal. The very first one. The cover fraying. The ink inside faded but intact. I handed it to him like a mirror. "Because I waited." I said, "I waited for you to remember me on your own. I waited through birthdays and weddings and voicemails that never came. And then you called me unstable. You questioned whether I could remember at all. So I showed the world what I never stopped remembering." He didn't open the journal. He stared at it like it might burn him. And in a way, I think it did. "You didn't have to make it public," he said. "You didn't have to turn it into a headline." I tilted my head. "No," I said softly, "but you didn't have to forget me in private either." For a moment, he looked like the boy I used to rock to sleep. The boy who once held my hand at the doctor's office because he was afraid of needles. And then it vanished, replaced by the man Eleanor had shaped. By the version of him that knew how to apologize without meaning it. "What do you want?" he asked, voice brittle now. "Is this about money, about recognition?" I almost laughed. "Almost. I want nothing," I said. "Not your apology. Not your attention. Not your redemption arc. I only wanted the space to exist, and I carved it myself." He stood there, the journal still untouched in his hand, and I could see him struggling between two instincts, the one that wanted to yell, and the one that knew yelling wouldn't work here. "You raised me," he said finally, and for the first time, there was a crack in his tone. "You made me who I am." I nodded. "I did, but I didn't teach you how to forget. That part you learned on your own." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was final. He placed the journal back on the table. Gently this time. almost with reverence. Then he turned, walked to the door, paused only once before stepping out. He didn't look back. He didn't say goodbye, and I didn't close the door right away. I watched his car disappear down the street, the same one I used to wait on with a flashlight when he was late coming home. When the taillights vanished, I whispered to the empty room. He came back, but not to stay. And then I sat at the table, the cup of tea still warm in my hand. And I felt nothing like victory and everything like peace. He didn't come back to ask for forgiveness. He just came to see if I still belonged to him. The days after he left passed like pages without headlines, quiet, steady, strangely whole. There was no follow-up call, no knock on the door, no letter slid under the mat, and I didn't expect one. I didn't sit by the phone. I didn't check my inbox with hope clawing at the corners. I just lived. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just with a kind of stillness I had forgotten belonged to me. The article kept moving, kept finding people I'd never meet, drawing out stories from inboxes that filled faster than I could open. A woman from Sweden wrote to say her daughter hadn't spoken to her in 10 years, and after reading my piece, she wrote a letter and burned it. Not to send, but to release. Another said her mother had raised a house full of children who never once asked her what she wanted for her birthday. She read my story and cried in her parked car for 37 minutes. A young man wrote, "I used to think my foster mother was overbearing. Now I realize she was just afraid I'd disappear too." They came one after another, not praise, not sympathy, but recognition. A chorus of unseen women and half-remembered caretakers saying, "Me too, me too." I thought it was just me. I started walking again every morning at 7 past the bakery, where I used to buy Daniel cinnamon rolls. Down the path behind the library, where he once picked a daisy and gave it to me with the stem bent and the petals all falling. I passed the park where he broke his arm falling off the jungle gym, where I sat holding his hand in the ER, whispering, "You're brave, baby. You're so brave." The whispers came back to me now, but not like ghosts, more like echoes I finally had room to hear. I began writing again. Not journals. Letters to myself. Not because I needed to record anymore, but because I was learning how to speak directly to the one person I had neglected for decades, me. I wrote things like, "You did not imagine it. You were there. Your hands did the holding. Your feet did the standing. You do not owe them your silence." I taught a small writing class at the community center on Wednesdays. 5 women joined, all over 60, all with stories no one had ever asked to hear. We called it the Quiet Chapter, and in that room, no one apologized for remembering too much or not enough. We wrote about daughters who stopped calling, husbands who never looked up from their plates, friends who faded the moment grief arrived. We read aloud. We cried without shame. We laughed like people who had finally exhaled. One afternoon, a woman named Ruth brought in a picture of her teenage son and said, "He thinks I'm dramatic, but I kept every drawing he ever made." She pulled out a folder thicker than a Bible. We all nodded. We knew. We didn't need to explain why that mattered. Back home, I cleared the shelf above the kitchen sink, the one that used to hold spice jars and expired vitamins, and I placed 3 things there. The first journal I ever wrote to Daniel, the photo of him holding a pinwheel at age 4, and a handwritten quote on an index card, "I am not waiting to be forgiven. I am done asking to be remembered." Some days I looked at that shelf and felt like a woman who had survived a war no one saw. Other days, I just saw a mother who finally gave herself a place at her own table. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't noble. I was tired. Yes, but not defeated. There's a difference. Defeat expects someone to lift you. Tired just means you've carried too much for too long, and you're finally allowed to set it down. One morning, I received a letter from a young woman who had found the article printed and taped to the wall of a bookstore bathroom. She said, "I don't know you, but I'm 22, and my mother and I haven't spoken in 2 years. Your words made me think maybe I should call her. Not to fix things, just to say she mattered. I cried after reading that, not because I needed thanks, but because somewhere, someone was unlacing a silence before it hardened. Somewhere, a mother might hear her name spoken kindly again. That was enough. I didn't need Daniel to apologize. I didn't need him to understand what I had done or what it cost me. Healing didn't come from him. It came the moment I stopped thinking my story needed to be small enough to fit into someone else's comfort. And when I finally closed the lid on the last journal, the one I hadn't written in since he turned 18, I didn't cry. I just whispered, "You're free now, and so am I." He didn't ask for forgiveness. I just stopped holding my breath, waiting to be seen. They invited me to speak, not on a stage, not under lights, but in a quiet corner of the public library. And the kind with folding chairs and a single microphone that squeaked when tested. The kind of space where people came not for spectacle, but for truth. It was part of a local series, Women Who Remember, and they had read the article, heard about the writing group, and asked if I would share something, anything, with those who still thought they were alone. I said yes, though I wasn't sure what I'd say. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't want a podium between me and the eyes that might look like mine. That evening, I wore my best blouse, the one I used to keep for church before I stopped pretending I needed buildings to find peace. The room was already half full when I arrived. Older women, younger women, a few men who sat with hands folded tightly in their laps. I stood when they called my name. There was no applause, just stillness, the kind that wraps around you like hands laced together in prayer. I told them a story, not the whole thing, not the headlines, not the part with the emails or the article or the son who forgot. I told them about a Tuesday in 1991 when Daniel got sick, and I stayed up all night making sure his fever didn't rise past the line I drew in my mind like a battlefield. I told them about how I once walked 3 miles in the rain to buy him the last book in a fantasy series he loved because I had promised it would be there after school. I told them about the silence that came after he left, and how it wasn't angry, it was worse. It was the kind that echoes louder when no one bothers to fill it. When I finished, no one clapped. One woman in the back simply whispered, "Thank you." And I think that meant more than anything else could have. Afterward, someone handed me a bouquet of wildflowers, messy, beautiful, undesigned, and I placed them in a chipped vase when I got home, right next to the journal I had left open on my desk. That night, I didn't write. I sat in my chair, the one near the window with the view of nothing in particular, and watched the streetlight flicker across the sidewalk like it was learning how to stay. I thought about all the times I had begged the world silently to notice me, not because I wanted fame, but because I didn't want to disappear before someone could say, "She was here. She mattered." A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a text. A real letter with a return address in California and handwriting I hadn't seen since he was 17. Daniel. I stared at the envelope for nearly an hour before I opened it. Inside was a single page. No apology, no explanation, just a sentence. "I read your words. I don't know what to say, but I'm listening." That was all. And somehow, it was enough. Because I no longer needed him to explain the forgetting. I only needed to know the remembering had finally begun. I placed the letter in the back of the final journal, the one I thought I'd never add to again. I didn't write a reply. Not yet. Some healing doesn't rush. Some dignity grows slowly, like moss on old stone, quiet, sure, undisturbed by wind. A week later, the librarian from the event sent me a photo. My quote, the one about not asking to be remembered, had been framed and placed above the checkout desk. She said people stopped to read it every day. Some cried, some smiled, some just stood in silence. I printed the picture and pinned it to my kitchen corkboard next to grocery lists and recipes faded from use. It belonged there not as a trophy, but as a reminder that what we speak in the quiet can still carry through walls we were never invited to enter. I didn't need Daniel to stand beside me. I didn't need recognition in bold print or a reunion wrapped in closure. I had my story told on my terms. I had a name that had once only existed inside journals, now resting gently in other people's hands. I had the dignity of not disappearing even when the world asked me to. And in the soft, slow hours of the day, when the light moved across my floor like a silent blessing, I whispered to the space that used to ache. You did not vanish. You simply waited long enough to be seen. He didn't return to walk beside me. I just stopped walking. In his shadow, the house is quieter now. But it's not the same kind of quiet that used to ache in the walls. It's a different kind. One that hums instead of haunts, that holds instead of hollows. I move slower these days, not because I am weak, but because I've learned that dignity walks with a measured pace. Each morning I wake before the sun, boil water for tea, open the curtains, and let the light in not to search for shadows of who I used to be, but to warm the woman who stayed, the woman who remembered, the woman who never left herself. I no longer stand by the phone. I don't wait for Daniel's name to appear, though sometimes I think of him when the kettle whistles his first burnt toast, his oversized backpack, the way he used to press his cheek against my shoulder like it was the only thing in the world that made him feel safe. I keep those memories where they belong, not as chains, not as wounds, but as living proof that I was once someone's beginning. Even if they outgrew the story I gave them, healing, I've learned, is not about mending what broke.